The gavel had not yet fallen when Amos Granger put his boot on the auction crate and pushed it over, spilling the land agent's ledger book into the frozen mud of the three-island crossing town square. "That woman is not chattel, and she is not for sale," he said, loud enough that the whole crowd of homesteaders and idle cowhands turned from their breath-fogged huddles to look. Virginia Carter stood on the platform where she had been placed not 10 minutes before, her wrists unbound but her pride bound tight as any rope, a hand-lettered sign reading labor contract, 2 years, good cook and seamstress hanging from a nail above her head. She had not screamed. She had not wept. She had simply stood there with her spine straight and her jaw set, doing arithmetic in her head about how long it would take to walk to the nearest army post, and how much good it would do her once she got there, because her Uncle Silas Prout owned every deputy for 40 miles and most of the judges too. "Mr. Granger," Silas said smoothly, straightening his string tie, "you are interfering with a legal proceeding to satisfy a debt owed by my niece's late father's estate. I am the appointed guardian of Miss Carter's affairs, as the circuit judge in Boise City will confirm. I've heard of appointed guardians who sell off their wards to cover gambling markers," Amos said. "I've never heard of one who does it in the town square in front of God and the Snake River both." A murmur went through the crowd. Amos Granger was not a local man, but he had ridden in 3 days before at the head of 5 wagons of families bound for the last open bottomland claims west of the crossing, and word traveled fast in a settlement this size that he had crossed the Rockies 11 times as a hired wagon master, and never lost a soul to the trail who hadn't been sick or old before they started. Men listened to a man like that, even men who owed Silas Prout money. "This is a land office matter," Silas said, and there was iron under the silk now. "I'd remind you, sir, that you are new to this territory and do not understand how things are done here." "I understand a rigged sale when I see one," Amos said. He climbed onto the crate himself, took Virginia's hand without asking permission, and helped her down as though she were stepping off a church pew rather than an auction block. "Miss Carter, is there a debt?" "There is a debt my uncle invented," Virginia said, and her voice, when it finally came, was steady as a rifle barrel. "My father owed no man money when he died. I have his account books. I have kept them myself for 3 years, because my uncle never once rode out to check on us, not even when the fever took my mother, and not even when it took my father a year later. He did not become concerned with my welfare until the survey crews started marking new lines through the bottomland my father proved up." The crowd's murmur turned into something sharper. Land was the one subject in this country that could turn a quiet Tuesday into a range war, and every homesteader within earshot had a claim of his own resting on the same shaky ground of surveys and filings, and the good faith of the man who ran the land office. Silas's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes went flat and cold as the river ice. "My niece is given to fancies," he said. "Her mother's people had a great deal of superstition in them, and I fear some of it took root. She has refused 3 respectable offers of marriage that would have settled her affairs honestly, and I have been forced to take sterner measures." "Sterner measures," Amos repeated, and he did not raise his voice, which somehow made it worse for Silas than if he had shouted. "You mean selling her like a milk cow. I mean providing for a young woman incapable of managing property on her own. She just managed to keep her own account books for 3 years while burying both her parents," Amos said. "Seems to me she's managing a sight better than most men I know." A few of the homesteader wives laughed outright at that, sharp and short, the kind of laugh that comes from women who have buried husbands or children themselves and know exactly what it costs to keep a household running through grief. Silas's face reddened. "You have no standing here, Granger. I've got 5 wagons of families depending on me to get their claims filed clean before winter locks this river solid," Amos said. "That gives me all the standing I need to ask questions about how this land office does its business. And right now I'm asking why a grown man needs to auction his niece off in the street instead of just showing the judge his paperwork." For one long moment nobody moved. Then Silas Prout did the thing that men like him always did when cornered in public. He smiled wider, spread his hands, and pretended the whole matter was beneath him. "Take her then, if you're so eager to play knight-errant," he said. "I wash my hands of the trouble, but mark me, Granger, you've bought yourself a lawsuit and a headache, and Miss Carter has bought herself no friend in this town's only land office. Come the spring, when your wagon families need their filings recorded, we'll see how far your gallantry carries them." He turned and walked off through the parting crowd, and the auction dissolved the way spilled water finds every low place at once, men drifting back to their business, embarrassed to have watched, a few of them meeting Virginia's eyes with something like shame. Virginia let out a breath she had been holding since sunrise and looked at the tall, weathered stranger who still had hold of her hand. "I could have talked my own way off that crate," she said. "I don't doubt it," Amos said, releasing her at once, as though he'd only just noticed he was still holding on. "But you'd have had to talk considerably longer, and it was cold enough up there to freeze the words in your mouth." Despite everything, despite the humiliation still burning in her chest, Virginia felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "You always interrupt auctions you know nothing about, Mr. Granger. Only the one selling people," he said. "Cattle I let go at whatever price the fool bidding wants to pay." That earned him a real, if brief, laugh from her, surprised out of her like a bird startled off a fence rail. Then the cold and the fear and the fury all caught up with her at once, and she had to press the back of her wrist hard against her mouth to keep from shaking apart in front of the whole town. Amos noticed. He did not touch her again, did not offer some grand gesture, only stepped between her and the lingering crowd so that her back was shielded from their stares, and said, "Lo, there's a stove going in the trading post. Nobody's going to bother you there. Come on." She went with him because there was nowhere else to go, and because, for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked at her and seen a person instead of a problem to be solved or a debt to be collected. The trading post belonged to a wiry, gray-whiskered man named Otis Boone, who took one look at Virginia's face and set a tin cup of hot coffee in front of her without being asked, then found urgent business restocking his shelves at the far end of the store, granting them privacy without ever leaving the room. Virginia wrapped both hands around the cup and did not drink from it, only let the heat seep into her fingers, which had gone white with cold on that crate. "Your uncle," Amos said, sitting across the plank table from her, "is he really the land agent for this whole crossing?" "For 60 miles either direction," Virginia said. "Father Prout himself, that's what folks call him behind his back, on account of how many confessions he collects. Every homestead claim, every filing, every water right through this whole stretch of the Snake goes through his office before it goes to Boise City. And your father's claim, 640 acres of the best bottomland this side of the river, proved up fair and square, patent granted 2 years before he died." Her hands tightened on the cup. "Silas has been telling people for a year that the patent was never properly filed, that there was an error in the survey. He's had 3 different families sniffing around that land already, thinking they might get it declared open again." Amos went very still in the particular way of a man who has just heard something that matters more than he first let on. "How many other families has he told that about?" Virginia looked up at him, and something cold that had nothing to do with the weather crawled up her spine. "I don't know," she said slowly. "Why?" "Because 2 of the families I brought in with my train filed claims through your uncle's office 3 days ago," Amos said. "And this morning, before I ever heard your name, one of them showed me a letter saying his filing fee didn't clear because of a discrepancy in the survey markers, and he'd need to pay again to secure the parcel he already thought he owned." The coffee in Virginia's cup had gone still as a mirror. She set it down very carefully, the way a person sets down something they are afraid of breaking, or of it breaking them. "That's the same story," she whispered. "Word for word, nearly, the same story he told about my father's land. You think he's doing this to more than one family?" "I think," Virginia said, and now her voice had lost its shake and found something harder underneath, that I need to see the land office's real books, not the ones he shows the circuit judge, the ones he keeps for himself. Amos leaned back, studying her with an expression she could not quite read, something between caution and respect. "You planning to break into a federal land office, Miss Carter?" "I'm planning to protect people who trusted my uncle with their whole future," she said. "The same way my father trusted him, right up until the day he died believing his brother-in-law would look after his daughter instead of selling her at auction." Something shifted in Amos Granger's face then, some door opening that had been shut a long while. "I've got families depending on clean filings before this river freezes solid enough to lock in the boundaries for spring," he said. "If your uncle's cheating them the way he cheated your father, I need to know it before I hand them over to build their whole lives on a lie." "Then it seems," Virginia said, "we have the same enemy, Mr. Granger." "Seems that way," he agreed, and for the first time since she had climbed down off that crate, Virginia Carter felt something other than fear settle into the hollow of her chest. It was not quite hope, but it was close enough kin to it that she let herself hold onto the feeling all the way through the cold walk back to what remained of her father's ranch house, a mile upriver, where the fire had gone out in the hearth, and the wind came through the door frame like it owned the place. The land office sat at the north end of the settlement, a squat log building with a tin roof, and a window that Silas Prout kept curtained even in daylight, as though sunlight itself might expose something he preferred kept in shadow. Virginia had grown up walking past that building on her way to church, never once suspecting what its ledgers truly held, and it was strange now, 3 nights after the auction, to be crouched behind its woodpile in the deep cold with Amos Granger at her shoulder, waiting for the lamp in the window to finally go dark. "You don't have to come in with me," she whispered. "If we're caught, I can say I'm his niece looking for my father's papers. You've got no excuse at all." "I've got a wagon train full of families who paid good money for land that might not be theirs," Amos whispered back. "That's excuse enough for me." The lamp guttered out. They gave it a slow count of 200, the cold biting through Virginia's wool coat and Amos's buffalo hide, before he tried the back window and found it, as she had promised, loose in its frame from years of swelling and shrinking with the seasons. He boosted her through first, quiet as a man who had done this sort of thing before, though when she raised an eyebrow at him through the gap he only shrugged. "Wagon masters learn all manner of skills getting greenhorns out of trouble," he murmured, climbing through after her. "Don't ask which trouble taught me windows." Inside, the office smelled of tallow candles and pipe tobacco, and the particular dry paper smell of a room full of filed claims. Virginia went straight to the cabinet behind Silas's desk, the one he always kept locked, and produced from her coat pocket a key she had lifted from his coat 3 years before, back when she still trusted him enough to think it a harmless bit of mischief to know where he kept his good whiskey. The lock gave with a soft click. Inside, beneath a false bottom that any competent carpenter would have spotted in a heartbeat, but which had clearly fooled every land office inspector who ever passed through, lay a second ledger, its leather cover worn soft with handling. Virginia's hands shook as she opened it by lantern light, cupped low so no glow would show through the curtained window. Amos stood at her shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through 2 coats, and together they read. It was all there in Silas Prout's own careful hand, claims filed and marked valid in the official record, and beside each one, in a second column, a note of a correction fee collected in cash, off the books, from settlers told their filings had errors that needed remedy. Some entries showed the same parcel sold twice over, once to the original homesteader and once quietly to a speculator from Boise City who paid Silas handsomely to hold the deed in reserve until the real claimant gave up in frustration or moved on. Her father's name was there, 640 acres, marked pending correction, though the patent in Virginia's own trunk at home said otherwise. Beneath his name were 11 others, the Hendersons, the Millers, the O'Briens. Names Virginia had known her whole life, families who had broken their backs turning sod and burying children along this river. All of them told their claims were shadowed with doubt, all of them being slowly bled of what little cash they had left, all of them one bad season away from simply walking off in despair and leaving Silas free to sell their land again to whoever paid best. 11 families, Amos said quietly. 11, not counting mine. 14, counting yours, Virginia said, her finger trembling on the page. Look here. He's already written in the 2 you told me about, and a third, see, the Alvarez family 3 days past. He's planning to send the same letter to all of them come spring, once the ground's thawed enough for men to feel desperate to plant. Why wait for spring? Because a man who's lost his whole winter's savings to a false fee still has time to recover if he learns the truth in January, Virginia said. But a man who's already planted his seed corn and built his fences will pay anything, anything at all, rather than start over in June with nothing in the ground. Amos was quiet a long moment, looking down at the names in that ledger with the particular grief of a man who had promised those very families safe passage and a future, and now understood he had delivered them instead into the hands of a wolf wearing a land agent's coat. We copy it, he said finally, every page. Then we get it back before he knows it's been touched, and we ride to every one of those families before the ground freezes hard enough that he can claim the survey markers shifted, and nobody can prove otherwise. There's 14 families, Mr. Granger, scattered across 60 miles of frozen prairie, and only one of me who can read this hand well enough to make sense of the abbreviations, and only one of you who knows which trails are safe enough to cross in this cold. Then we'd best get started, Amos said, because we haven't got but a handful of days before that river locks up entirely and half those families get cut off from the crossing until spring thaw. They copied through the night by candle stub, Virginia's hand cramping around the borrowed pencil, Amos holding the lantern steady, and more than once, steadying her nerve with a quiet joke about Silas Prute's penmanship being almost as crooked as his business. By the time the first gray light showed at the window, they had every page transcribed onto paper Virginia hid inside the lining of her coat, and the ledger was back in its false bottom, the cabinet locked, the key back in her pocket, and the 2 of them slipping out the same loose window into a morning so cold it hurt to breathe. They did not speak until they were well clear of the settlement, walking their horses along the frozen ruts of the river road, breath clouding white in the pale dawn. You're a hard woman to frighten, Virginia Carter, Amos said finally. I stopped frightening easy the day I buried my mother, she said. There wasn't much energy left over for it after that. How'd she pass? Fever, same as took my father a year later, though it took her slower and crueler. Virginia's eyes were fixed on the frozen river running silver-black beside the road. She was Shoshone, my mother. Married my father when this whole valley was still open range, and nobody much cared who a man loved so long as he could hold his ground. I spoke her tongue before I spoke English good and proper. That's half of why the army post pays me, when they've a mind to talk peace instead of powder with the bands still camped up along the Bruno. That where you learn to keep your nerve in a tight spot, translating between men who'd sooner shoot each other than talk. Something like that, Virginia said, and there was a ghost of a smile in it now, tired but real. You learn quick that the only thing standing between calm words and a massacre is somebody willing to say the truth clear and say it fast, even when it's easier to let a lie sit unchallenged. Amos looked at her for a long moment, the cold wind pulling color into both their faces, and something in his chest, some old locked door that had stayed shut through 11 hard crossings and more good men buried along the trail than he cared to count, creaked open another inch. I reckon that's exactly the sort of nerve we're going to need, he said, riding out to tell 14 families their land agent's been robbing them blind. Then we'd better start today, Virginia said, before the cold finishes what my uncle started. They rode out from the ranch house before the sun had fully cleared the eastern bluffs, Virginia on her father's old bay mare, Amos on the rangy gray gelding he had ridden the whole 1,100 miles from Independence, both of them wrapped in every scrap of wool, and hide they owned against a cold that had teeth in it. The kind of bitter, bone-deep chill that settled over the high desert country in the weeks before the snake froze solid enough to walk across. The Hendersons were first, a mile and a half upriver in a soddy dug into the hillside, smoke rising thin and gray from the chimney pipe. Jed Henderson came out at the sound of hooves with a shotgun cradled loose in his arms, the wariness of a man who had learned the hard way that strangers on a winter road rarely brought good news. "Miss Carter," he said, lowering the gun a fraction when he recognized her, "and you'd be the wagon master. Come to collect the rest of that filing fee your uncle's clerk mentioned." "Come to tell you there is no filing fee, Mr. Henderson, and there never should have been one," Virginia said, and she dismounted right there in the yard, pulled the folded papers from inside her coat, and laid the truth before him plain as she could make it, page after page of her uncle's own hand condemning him. Jed Henderson's face went through several colors reading it, his wife coming out onto the step with a baby on her hip and 2 more children peering around her skirts, and by the time Virginia finished explaining what the double column of figures meant, the man was shaking, not from cold. "I paid him $30 not 2 weeks past," he said. $30 I dug out of grocery money for my own children, because his letter said the survey stake had shifted and my east line might overlap the section behind it. "There was no shifted stake," Virginia said gently. "There's no error at all. Your claim is clean, Mr. Henderson, clean as any patent ever filed. He invented the trouble so he could charge you to fix it." "Then I want that $30 back," Henderson said, and his wife behind him said something sharper and less polite that made her husband's ears go red even in the cold. "You'll have every chance to get it back," Amos said, swinging down from his own horse now, "but it'll take more than one angry homesteader marching into that office. It'll take all of you together, with proof he can't argue his way around. That's why we're riding out today, to every family in that ledger, so that, when the time comes to face him, he's facing 14 families at once instead of one man he can bully alone." Henderson looked at the papers again, then at Virginia, then at the tall stranger beside her. "You're risking a great deal riding out like this," he said slowly. "Man like Prout won't take kindly to losing his little game." "He's already shown me exactly how far he'll go," Virginia said, thinking of the auction crate, the cold mud, the sign hung above her head like she was livestock. "There's nothing left for him to threaten me with that he hasn't already tried." They left the Hendersons with a promise and a warning, to say nothing to anyone until word had reached every family, lest Silas hear of it too soon, and find some way to move his money and his lies out of reach before the reckoning came. Then it was on to the next claim, and the next, the short winter day burning down fast as they rode from cabin to soddy to half-finished frame house, Virginia reading the ledger's cramped hand aloud at every stop, Amos standing quiet and steady at her side, ready with a calming word whenever grief or fury threatened to boil over into something dangerous. It was slow, hard work, made harder by the cold, which crept in around the edges of even the warmest coat and turned the horses' breath to rhyme on their whiskers. By midday they had covered 6 families, and Virginia's voice had gone hoarse from talking, her fingers stiff from handling paper in air cold enough to bite. "You should eat something," Amos said, when they stopped to water the horses at a frozen creek they had to break open with a hatchet. "You haven't touched food since sunup." "There's no time," Virginia said. "There's always time to eat, Miss Carter, or you'll be no use to the next family at all, falling off your horse from hunger." He produced a twist of paper from his saddlebag, hard biscuit and dried beef, and pressed it into her hands with the same quiet firmness he'd used to help her down off the auction block. "Eat. I'll watch the road." She ate, grudgingly at first and then with real hunger once she started, and found him watching her with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite something else. "What?" she said, around a mouthful of biscuit. "Nothing. Just thinking you're about the least helpless woman I ever met, and your uncle stood up in front of the whole town and called you incapable." Men like Silas call any woman incapable who won't let them steal from her quietly, Virginia said. It's easier to sell a woman off as foolish than to admit you're afraid of what she knows. Amos laughed, short and surprised, and the sound of it warmed something in her chest more than the biscuit had. I've crossed 1,100 miles of trail 11 times over, he said, buried 2 wagon masters who thought they knew better than the weather, and pulled more fool greenhorns out of quicksand than I care to count. I don't scare easy either, Miss Carter. But I'll tell you plain. Watching you stand up on that auction block with your chin up like you were the one doing the judging instead of the other way around, that scared me a little. Scared me because I thought, there goes a woman who doesn't need saving by anybody, and I didn't rightly know what to do with a feeling like that. Virginia looked at him for a long moment, the cold forgotten, the ledger forgot, the whole hard, urgent business of the day forgotten for just that one breath. I don't need saving, she said finally, softly. But I wouldn't have minded the company, even before you spoke a word. Something passed between them then, quick and warm as a struck match in the cold, and neither of them said anything more about it, because there were still 8 families left to warn before dark, and the sun was already sliding low and orange toward the western bluffs. They rode on. The Millers took the news hard, old Ezekiel Miller, sitting down heavily on his own chopping block, when Virginia read him the figures, his grown son cursing steadily under his breath in a way his mother did not bother to correct. The O'Briens, newer to the country and quicker to anger, wanted to ride straight into town and burn the land office down, and it took both Virginia's steady reasoning and Amos's grave, experienced calm to convince them that a mob with torches would only hand Silas prudent excuse to call the army, and have every last one of them arrested for disturbing the peace, leaving the ledger's proof buried and useless. We do this smart, Amos told them, standing in the O'Brien's dooryard with the last light going purple over the frozen fields, or we don't do it at all. Miss Carter's risked her neck copying that book. We don't waste it on a bonfire that gets you all thrown in jail before the truth's ever heard by anyone who matters. By the time full dark fell, they had reached 10 of the 14 families, and Virginia was swaying in her saddle with exhaustion, her voice reduced to a rasp, her hands so cold inside her gloves she could barely feel the reins. We stop here, Amos said, when they reached a stand of cottonwoods along the riverbank that offered some shelter from the wind. 4 families left. They'll keep till morning. You won't if we push on through this cold in the dark. I can keep going. I know you can, that's not the question. The question is whether I'm willing to let you kill yourself proving it, and I am not. He was already dismounting, already gathering deadfall for a fire with the brisk efficiency of a man who had made camp in worse conditions 100 times over. Get down off that horse, Virginia, before you fall off it. It was the first time he had used her given name without the miss in front of it, and something about the plainness of it, the bare honesty, made her obey without argument. They built the fire close under the cottonwoods, banked against the wind, and Amos rigged a linta from the wagon canvas he carried rolled behind his saddle, more out of long habit than any real expectation of comfort. They sat close to the flames, sharing the last of the dried beef, and for a while neither of them spoke, letting the fire's warmth and the crackle of burning cottonwood fill the silence. "Tell me about your crossings," Virginia said eventually. 11 times, you said. What made you keep going back? Amos was quiet a moment, staring into the flames. First time I was 22, hired on as a hand, not even a master. Lost my own young wife to cholera the year before, back in Ohio, and I didn't much care whether I lived or died, so the trail seemed as good a place as any to find out. He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way a man speaks of an old wound long since healed over but never quite forgotten. Turned out I was good at it. Reading weather, reading river crossings, keeping families calm when the wolves were closer than they liked or the water ran higher than it should. 10 years, 10 more crossings, and I told myself each one would be the last, and each spring I signed on again because it was the only thing I knew how to do that felt like it mattered. And this one, The 11th. This one is the last, truly the last, he said. I've got money saved enough for 80 acres and a house that doesn't leak if I can find the right stretch of ground and nobody cheats me out of the filing. He glanced at her and there was something rueful in it. Funny thing to say to you given the day we've had. Not funny, Virginia said. Just honest. Where's this 80 acres you're dreaming of? Haven't found it yet. Was thinking somewhere along this very river, if I'm honest, once I saw the bottomland here. Good soil, good water, close enough to the crossing to matter if the town ever grows into something more than a ferry stop and a land office. He smiled, small and a little embarrassed. Guess I ought to make sure the land office isn't crooked before I go trusting it with my life savings. Guess you ought, Virginia agreed, and found herself smiling back, the fire warm on her face, the cold night pressing close around the small circle of their camp, and for just a moment the whole hard, frightening business of ledgers and fraud and stolen inheritances felt very far away, replaced by something quieter and warmer that neither of them named aloud, though both of them felt it settle between them like a second fire, banked but steadily burning. They finished the last 4 families by mid-morning the next day. The Alvarez family and 3 others whose names Virginia had known her whole life without ever knowing the depth of the danger they stood in. Each stop followed the same pattern, disbelief giving way to fury, giving way to a grim, determined resolve, until by the time they turned their tired horses back toward the settlement, 14 families stood united in the knowledge of what had been done to them, and in the quiet, dangerous decision to do something about it together. But word, as word always does in a country this thin on people and this thick on gossip, had begun to travel faster than even Amos and Virginia's hard riding could outpace. They came back into 3 Island crossing at dusk on the second day to find the settlement humming with a tension that had nothing to do with the cold. Otis Boone met them at the edge of town, his face grave under his gray whiskers. "Prout knows," he said without preamble. Henderson's boy got drunk and mouthed off in the saloon about getting his $30 back, and word reached the land office inside the hour. Silas has had his hired men riding the roads all day looking for you too. Virginia's stomach dropped, but Amos's face only went hard and still, the calm of a man who had faced down river crossings and wolf packs and knew that panic solved nothing. "The copies," he said. "Where are they?" "Safe," Virginia said, patting the lining of her coat. "I haven't let them out of my keeping." "That's exactly why they'll come for you first," Boone said. "There's more and it's worse." Prout's clerk, young Ezra Higgins, the one who actually keeps the real books when Prout's too drunk or too lazy to do his own figuring. He's got cold feet. Word is he's taken the original ledger, the real one, not your copies, and he's running for the rail line at Eagle Rock, meaning to sell what he knows to the highest bidder, maybe the railroad speculators, maybe Prout himself if he pays enough to buy the man's silence. When did he leave? This morning before first light. If he makes the noon train tomorrow out of Eagle Rock, he's gone clear to Utah or beyond, and with him goes the only original proof strong enough to stand up in a federal court, because your copies, Miss Carter, forgive me, are just a woman's handwriting claiming what a land agent's own book says. A judge might doubt you. Nobody doubts the original, especially not with the clerk's own testimony behind it. Virginia felt the ground shift under her, the exhaustion of 2 days' hard riding crashing against this new, urgent danger. "Eagle Rock is 90 miles, she said. 90 miles and the noon train tomorrow." Amos was already turning his tired gray gelding back toward the livery. "Then we need fresh horses, and we need to leave within the hour and we ride through the night." "Amos, that's asking those horses to cover 90 miles of frozen trail in under a day. It's asking a great deal of both of us, too. I've asked wagon trains to cross the Rockies in October snow before," he said. "This is nothing by comparison except that it matters just as much." He looked at her, and there was no doubt in his face at all, only a fierce, steady resolve that made her chest ache with something that was not fear. "You coming, or do I ride alone? You couldn't leave me behind if you tried, Virginia said, already moving toward the livery herself. I'm the only one who can prove what that ledger means once we catch him. They traded their worn horses for two of Otis Boone's freshest, a sturdy roan and a leggy black mare that Boone swore could run all night if given the chance. And within the hour they were riding hard into the deepening cold, the frozen prairie stretching pale and merciless under a rising moon, both of them driven by the same desperate arithmetic. 90 miles, one train and 14 families' futures riding on weather too tired. Half-frozen travelers could beat a frightened clerk to the platform before the whistle blew. The night ride to Eagle Rock became, in later years, the story Virginia told most often when asked how she had come to love a wagon master twice her acquaintance in age and half her acquaintance in years, though at the time it felt like nothing so much as a slow, grinding trial by cold. They rode in long, punishing stretches, walking the horses to rest them, then pushing to a lope again once the animals had caught their wind, the moon their only light across a landscape scoured flat and white by wind that never once let up its knife-edged bite. Somewhere past midnight, with the cold sinking so deep into Virginia's bones that she could no longer feel her own toes inside her boots, Amos called a halt beside a stand of sage large enough to break the worst of the wind, and made her dismount whether she wanted to or not. "We stop for 20 minutes, he said. "Longer than that and the horses seize up, less than that and you do." "I'm fine. You're shaking so hard I can hear your teeth from here." He was already unwrapping a blanket from behind his saddle, and before she could protest, he had it around her shoulders on top of her own coat, his hands lingering a moment at her collarbone as he tucked it close. Fine is a word people use when they're too proud to say cold, Virginia. She let him fuss over her because arguing took energy she did not have to spare, and because, if she were honest with herself, there was something in the careful, unhurried way he tended to her that felt like nothing she had known since her mother died, a kind of steady, wordless care that asked for nothing in return. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, when the shaking had eased enough that she trusted her voice. 90 miles in a night, for 14 families you barely know, one of whom is a niece who isn't even yours to protect. Amos was quiet a moment, crouched beside her, his breath clouding white between them. "When I was young, first crossing I ever made, we had a family, the Cartwrights, good people, 3 children, decent land waiting for them in the Willamette Valley. Their guide before me had taken their money and abandoned them halfway across Wyoming, left them to fend for themselves in a country that eats greenhorns alive. I found them wandering, half-starved, the youngest boy near dead from exposure. I got them through, but it cost that boy 2 fingers to frostbite, and it cost the whole family a year of their lives they never got back." He looked at her, firelight from some long-ago memory still burning in his eyes even here in the dark. "I swore after that I'd never let a man's greed cost a family everything they had, not while I had breath left to stop it. Your uncle's no different from that guide who abandoned the Cartwrights, just wears finer clothes doing it." Virginia felt something in her chest crack open at that, some wall she had built brick by brick since her mother's death, since her father's death, since every betrayal that had taught her to trust no one fully ever again. "My father used to say," she said slowly, "that the measure of a man wasn't what he did when everyone was watching but what he did when he thought no one would ever know. You didn't have to interrupt that auction. Nobody would have blamed you for riding on and minding your own wagons." "I'd have blamed myself," Amos said simply, "every day for the rest of my life." They looked at each other across the small space between them, the cold forgotten, the 90 miles forgotten, and for one long moment Virginia thought he might kiss her, and found with some surprise that she wanted him to. But the moment passed, both of them too aware of the clock ticking toward noon and the train that would not wait for either of them, and instead Amos simply reached out and squeezed her hand once hard before rising to check the horses. 20 minutes are up," he said, his voice a little rough. "We ride." They reached Eagle Rock as the gray light of morning was breaking over the eastern hills, both riders and horses staggering with exhaustion. The small rail town already stirring to life around the station, where the Utah and Northern Line had pushed its track the year before, bringing with it the first faint promise that this whole rough country might someday be something more than wagon ruts and river fords. The platform was already crowded when they arrived, farmers and merchants, and a handful of soldiers waiting for the noon train, their breath fogging thick in the bitter air, and Virginia's heart sank at the sight of so many strangers standing between them, and whatever thin chance remained of finding one frightened clerk in the crowd. "There," Amos said suddenly, pointing. Ezra Higgins stood near the far end of the platform, a slight, nervous young man in an ill-fitting coat, clutching a leather satchel to his chest like it held his very salvation, glancing constantly over his shoulder toward the road as though expecting pursuit even now. They dismounted and pushed through the gathering crowd, Virginia calling his name before Amos could stop her, a risk perhaps, but one that paid off when Higgins's head snapped up and his face went white with recognition and fear. "Miss Carter," he stammered, backing away, "I've got nothing to say to you, I've got business in Ogden, is all family business." "Ezra," Virginia said, keeping her voice low and even despite the pounding of her heart, "I know what's in that satchel. I know what Silas has been doing, and I know you've been keeping his real books all this time because he trusted you not to ask questions. I'm not here to accuse you of anything. I'm here because 14 families are about to lose everything they've worked for, and you're the only one who can stop it." "He'll ruin me," Higgins whispered. "Pruitt's got friends clear to the territorial governor's office. If I testify against him, I'll never work in this territory again, maybe never work anywhere." "And if you don't," Amos said, stepping up beside Virginia, his voice carrying the same calm authority he'd used to steady frightened greenhorns through 100 river crossings, "you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you had the power to stop a man from stealing children's futures out from under them, and you chose to run instead. That's a heavier weight to carry than any grudge Pruitt could hold, son. I've seen men break under lighter loads than that." The train's whistle sounded in the distance, still some minutes out but close enough that the platform began to stir with the particular restlessness of travelers gathering their bags, and Higgins's eyes darted toward the sound like a man measuring the last door out of a burning building. "You don't understand," he said. "I've already sold him the information about who's asking questions. Pruitt knows you're coming for the ledger. He sent men after me too, to make sure I don't talk, and he sent men after you, Miss Carter, to make sure you never make it back from wherever you rode off to." The words had barely left his mouth when a commotion broke out at the platform's edge, two rough-dressed men shouldering through the crowd with the particular urgency of hired muscle who had just spotted their quarry. Virginia recognized one of them from town, a man named Coombs who did odd, unpleasant jobs for whoever paid best, and her blood went cold. "Ezra Higgins," Coombs called out, "Mr. Pruitt wants a word with you about that satchel." Higgins made a strangled sound and bolted, not toward the men, but toward the train itself, still 100 yards down the track and slowing into the station, as though he could somehow escape both his employer's wrath and his own conscience by simply outrunning them both. "Stop him," Amos said, already moving. "But gently, Virginia, we can't have this turn into a brawl in front of half the county." Virginia surprised herself by darting ahead through the crowd faster than either the clerk or the pursuing men, cutting Higgins off at the edge of the platform, where the crowd thinned near the baggage cars, close enough to the approaching train that its rumble shook the boards beneath her feet. "Ezra, stop," she said, grabbing his sleeve. "Please, look at me. You don't have to be a hero. You just have to be honest once in front of witnesses who'll make sure Pruitt can't touch you for it." Higgins wrenched free of the crowd's shoulders, and nearly of her grip too, but something in her voice, some steady, pleading honesty, made him hesitate, And that hesitation was all Amos needed to close the distance and plant himself bodily between the fleeing clerk and the approaching hired men, his considerable frame filling the narrow gap between two stacked crates of freight. "Gentlemen," Amos said to Coombs and his companion, in a voice pitched to carry across the whole platform, "I don't believe this young man owes your employer anything more than the truth, and it looks to me like half this town is about to hear it whether Silas Prout likes it or not." The crowd, sensing drama the way crowds always do, had begun to gather closer, curious faces turning toward the small tableau at the platform's edge, and Coombs, aware suddenly of just how many witnesses stood watching, faltered. "This ain't your business, Granger." "Made it my business 3 days ago," Amos said. "Same day your employer tried to auction off a woman like a head of cattle in front of the whole town. Seems to me Silas Prout's business has a habit of becoming everyone's business, sooner or later." The train had fully stopped now, its whistle shrieking one last time before falling silent, passengers beginning to disembark and board in the confused shuffle typical of small frontier stations. And into that shuffle, Virginia raised her voice loud enough to carry over the noise. "This man," she called out, pointing at Higgins, still clutching his satchel, "has proof that the land agent at 3 Island Crossing has been cheating homesteaders out of their claims, charging false fees, selling land twice over for years. I have copies of his own ledger in my coat right now. Ask anyone from 3 Island Crossing standing on this platform. Ask the Hendersons, the Millers. Ask any family who's paid a correction fee they never should have owed." It was a gamble, shouting the accusation into a crowded public platform rather than saving it for a courtroom. But Virginia had learned enough about her uncle in the last 3 days to know that his power depended entirely on secrecy and the fear of individual families facing him alone. Strip away the secrecy, force the truth into the open air where 14 families could stand together instead of cowering separately, and Silas Prout's whole careful structure of lies would have nothing left to stand on. Higgins, perhaps moved by her courage, or perhaps simply calculating that a public confession now, with witnesses, offered better protection than continued flight, straightened his shoulders and opened the satchel with shaking hands. "It's all true," he said, his voice cracking but carrying. "Every word Miss Carter says is true. I've kept Silas Prout's real books for 2 years. I have the ledger right here in his own hand, showing every family he's cheated and every dollar he's stolen." He held the leather-bound book aloft, and a hush fell over the platform, broken only by the distant chuff of the waiting train's engine. "I was running because I was afraid, not because I doubted the truth of it. I'm not running anymore." Coombs and his companion, faced now with a public confession, and a growing crowd that included 2 off-duty soldiers and a territorial newspaperman who had happened to be traveling through, and was already scribbling furiously in a notebook, wisely decided that whatever Silas Prout was paying them, it was not enough to justify what would follow if they tried to seize the ledger by force in front of so many witnesses. They melted back into the crowd and were gone before the conductor's final call to board. Virginia took the ledger from Higgins's trembling hands with a gentleness that surprised even her, and for a moment the two of them simply stood there, the terrified clerk and the disinherited niece, both of them survivors of the same quiet, patient theft, and something like understanding passed between them. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Higgins said, some of the color returning to his face now that the worst was over. "You're the one who rode 90 miles in one night to stop me from running." "I just finally found the nerve to stop." Amos came to stand beside Virginia, watching the train pull away without either of them aboard it, Higgins choosing instead to return with them to 3 Island Crossing to testify in person before whatever tribunal could be assembled, and there was something in Amos's face, watching her hold that ledger against her chest, that told Virginia the man was thinking thoughts he had not yet found words for. "You did that," he said quietly, once the platform had begun to empty. "All of it." "I just stood in a doorway." "You stood exactly where you needed to stand," Virginia said, "same as you did at that auction." "Some battles are won with words, Amos Granger, but they're only winnable because someone brave enough is standing guard at the door." He looked at her for a long moment, and this time, with the crowd thinning around them and the cold morning sun finally breaking clear over the eastern hills, he did not let the moment pass. He reached up and brushed a strand of wind-loosened hair back from her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her wind-chapped cheek. "I don't scare easy," he said again, echoing his own words from 2 nights before. "But I'll tell you true, Virginia Carter, I have never in 11 crossings and 40 years of living met a woman who scares me half as much, in the best possible way, as you do." "Is that your notion of courting a woman, Mr. Granger? Telling her she frightens you?" "It's the truest thing I know how to say," he answered. And this time, when she leaned in, he closed the last small distance between them and kissed her, right there on the platform in the cold morning light, with tired horses stamping nearby and a newspaperman pretending very hard not to watch. And it was not a grand or dramatic kiss, only warm and certain and long overdue. The kind of kiss that answers a question neither party had quite worked up the courage to ask aloud. When they finally broke apart, Virginia found herself laughing, a real laugh, unburdened for the first time in days. "We have a ledger to deliver," she said, "and a land agent to bring down." "After you," Amos said, offering his arm with mock formality, and together they turned their tired horses back toward 3 Island Crossing, 90 miles behind them and a reckoning waiting ahead. The reckoning, when it came, was neither as violent nor as simple as either of them might have expected. They rode back into 3 Island Crossing 3 days later, having stopped along the way to gather the 14 families and bring them together, a slow-moving procession of wagons and riders that grew as it went, until by the time they reached the settlement itself, nearly 40 men, women, and children rode behind Virginia and Amos, along with a chastened but resolute Ezra Higgins and his damning ledger, and the territorial newspaper man, whose name was Cornelius Whitmore, and who scented the story of a lifetime, and had wired ahead to Boise City for a circuit judge to be summoned on urgent business. Silas Prout had, of course, heard of their approach long before they arrived, thanks to riders far faster than a wagon procession, and he met them not with more hired men, for Coombs and his fellow enforcers had wisely decided to seek employment elsewhere after the scene at Eagle Rock, but with a lawyer he had summoned from Boise City, and a face arranged into an expression of wounded, patient dignity. "This is quite a spectacle, Virginia," he said, standing on the steps of the land office as the procession filled the town square, the same square where he had tried to sell her 3 weeks before. "I suppose you mean to accuse me publicly rather than through proper legal channels." "I mean to see justice done, Uncle," Virginia said, dismounting and walking toward him with the ledger held before her like a shield. "And I mean to do it in front of every family you've cheated, so that no judge in Boise City can pretend this is merely a family quarrel over an inheritance." The circuit judge, a stern, silver-haired man named Judge Hollis Beaumont, who had ridden hard from Boise City on the strength of Whitmore's urgent telegram, arrived 2 days later, and the hearing that followed, held in the town's largest building, the church that served on weekdays as a schoolhouse, was attended by nearly the entire settlement. Virginia testified first, laying out the discovery of the ledger, the false claims of her own incompetence, the auction that had nearly sold her into indentured servitude to cover a debt that never existed. Ezra Higgins followed, confirming every figure, every forged correction, every dollar collected under false pretense. Then, one by one, the 14 families stood and told their own stories. Jed Henderson's $30, the O'Briens' near loss of their claim, the Millers' long months of anxious uncertainty, until the accumulated weight of testimony left even Silas Prout's expensive Boise City lawyer visibly struggling to construct a defense. Judge Beaumont's ruling, delivered on a bitter cold afternoon with frost thick on every window of the makeshift courtroom, was swift and unequivocal. Silas Prout was stripped of his position as land agent, effective immediately. His guardianship of Virginia Carter's affairs dissolved and declared to have been obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation, and every false claim, correction fee, and double-filed parcel in his crooked ledger was ordered voided and restored to its rightful homesteader at government expense. Silas himself was bound over for trial on charges of fraud, to be tried in Boise City, and led away by the territorial marshal amid a silence from the assembled crowd that was, in its own way, more damning than any shout of anger could have been. Virginia stood in the aftermath, her father's patent finally, unambiguously secure in her own name, 14 families' futures restored, and felt something inside her that had been clenched tight since her mother's death finally begin to loosen. But the reckoning, though it settled the ledger's lies, did not solve every problem the winter had brought, for the bitter cold that had made their night ride to Eagle Rock so punishing had, in the weeks since, deepened into a hard freeze that locked the Snake River solid at 3 Island Crossing, and with the ferry that Silas Prout had controlled through his crooked toll arrangements now abandoned. Its cables cut and its landing rotted through from years of deliberate neglect, designed to force settlers into costly dependence on his favored crossing points. The settlement faced a new and urgent crisis. Spring thaw would bring floodwaters, and without a proper crossing rebuilt before then, the whole community, along with any new families Amos might bring west in seasons to come, would be cut off from the vital trade and travel that the river crossing had always provided. It was Amos who first raised the idea, sitting with Virginia one evening in the rebuilt warmth of her father's ranch house, the fire crackling steady in a hearth that had stood cold and neglected for too long. "A ferry's not enough," he said, studying a rough sketch he had drawn on the back of an old land claim form. "Not for a crossing this important, not with more families coming west every season even now that the rails crept closer. What this crossing needs is a proper bridge timber trestle, strong enough to hold a loaded wagon even at spring flood." "That's an enormous undertaking," Virginia said. "Timber enough, labor enough. It would take the whole settlement working together for months." 14 families who just got their land back, Amos said. "Plus, however many more want to see this crossing safe for good. Seems to me there's no shortage of hands willing to work for a future they can trust." Virginia looked at him across the firelight, this steady, weathered man who had ridden 90 miles through bitter cold to save 14 families he barely knew, who had given up his 11th and final wagon crossing's easy conclusion to stay and fight a corrupt land agent instead, and felt the last of her old caution finally give way entirely. "You're not planning to move on then," she said, "once the spring thaw opens the trails again." "I told you I was looking for 80 acres along this river," Amos said, "before I knew what kind of trouble came bundled up with the best bottomland in the territory." He set his sketch aside and reached for her hand, his thumb tracing slow, gentle circles against her palm. "Truth is, Virginia, I've crossed this whole country 11 times looking for someplace worth staying, and I found it the same week I found you standing on an auction block with your chin up and your eyes full of fire. I'm not going anywhere, not unless you tell me to." "I'm not going to tell you that," Virginia said, her voice unsteady with an emotion she no longer bothered to hide. "I've spent 3 years alone in this house since my mother died, and another year alone since my father followed her, and I have gotten very tired, Amos Granger, of being strong all by myself." "You'll never have to be, not again," he said, and this time when he kissed her, there was no cold platform, no waiting train, no urgent errand pulling at either of them, only the fire's warmth and the quiet certainty of two people who had found, against every hard circumstance the frontier could throw at them, exactly the home they had been looking for. The bridge took the whole of that spring and half the summer to build, a community effort that drew in every family Silas Prout had once cheated, Along with new arrivals Amos brought west that following season, his final wagon train swelling into something more like the founding population of a proper town than a simple crossing point. Virginia's skills proved invaluable throughout, not only in organizing the settlers' labor and negotiating fair wages for those who worked the timber crews, but in the delicate, essential task of securing peaceful passage rights with the Shoshone-Bannock band camped along the Upper Bruno, whose own claims to traditional fishing grounds near the crossing had been threatened by Silas Pruitt's illegal dealings every bit as much as the Homesteaders had been. It was Virginia's fluency in her mother's tongue, and her patient, honest translation between two peoples who had every reason for mutual distrust after the previous summer's war, that secured an agreement allowing shared use of the crossing and the fishing grounds nearby. An agreement built not on force or threat, but on the same plain, careful truth-telling that had first brought down her uncle's fraud. There came a difficult afternoon that summer, though, when the timber contractor delivering the last of the trestle beams demanded payment in full before he would release the final shipment, a sum larger than the settlement's collected fund could quite cover. And Amos, without telling Virginia first, rode to Boise City intending to withdraw the whole of his life savings, the very 80-acre dream he had carried through 11 hard crossings, to make up the difference himself. Virginia discovered his intention only because Otis Boone, uneasy at keeping such a secret, mentioned it to her in passing, and she rode after Amos with the same fierce determination that had once carried her to 14 homesteads in 2 days. She caught him just outside the bank in Boise City, his saddlebags already heavy with the withdrawn coin. "You will not do this," she said, breathless from the hard ride, swinging down from her horse right there in the street. "Virginia, it's the only way to finish the bridge before the fall rains make the ford dangerous again." "It is not the only way, and I will not let you spend 11 years of hard-earned dreams to fix a problem that isn't yours alone to solve," she said. "That money is your future, Amos, our future, if you'll still have me, and I won't stand by and watch you sacrifice it because you're too proud or too stubborn to ask for help. What help is there left to ask for? We've exhausted the settlement's fund." "Not quite," Virginia said, and pulled from her coat a folded document she had carried the whole ride from 3 Island Crossing. The territorial court ordered restitution paid to every family Silas cheated, including my father's estate, and including a share of the fraudulent fees he collected that were never properly disbursed. I went to the court clerk this very morning and signed over my portion of that restitution, every dollar of it, toward the bridge fund. It's enough, Amos, combined with what the settlement's already raised, to cover the contractor's price without touching a cent of your savings." Amos stared at her, something fierce and tender warring across his weathered face. "That money is your inheritance, Virginia. Your father worked his whole life for that land, and the restitution is meant to make you whole again after everything Silas stole. My father's land is already whole, already mine, secure and safe," Virginia said. "But you, Amos Granger, worked 11 hard years and 11 hard crossings for that 80 acres, and I will not let you give it up when there is another way. Let me do this. Let me protect your dream the same way you protected 14 families' futures, without ever once asking what it might cost you." For a long moment, standing there on a dusty Boise City street with the summer sun beating down, and his life savings still heavy in his saddlebags, Amos Granger looked at Virginia Carter and understood, with the same clarity that had once told him to interrupt an auction he had no business interrupting, that he had found something rarer than 80 good acres or 11 safe crossings. He had found a partner whose courage matched his own, and whose love, freely given, asked nothing in sacrifice that it was not equally willing to offer in return. "All right," he said finally, his voice thick. "All right, Virginia. We'll use your restitution and I'll keep my savings, and we'll build something together with both, once the bridge is finished." "Something together," Virginia repeated, testing the words, and found she liked their shape very much indeed. The bridge was completed by the first frost of the following autumn, a sturdy timber trestle spanning the Snake at 3 Island Crossing, strong enough to hold the heaviest loaded wagon even at spring flood, built by the combined labor of every family Silas Prout had once tried to cheat, and named, at the unanimous insistence of the settlement, the Granger Crossing, a fact that made Virginia blush every time she heard it spoken aloud. They were married that same autumn in the same small church that had served as courtroom for Silas Prout's downfall, with all 14 rescued families in attendance, along with Ezra Higgins, who had gone on to become the settlement's honest new land agent, and Otis Boone, who gave away the bride since her own father could not, and even a delegation from the Shoshone-Bannock Band, whose peace agreement with the settlement Virginia's careful diplomacy had helped secure, and who came bearing gifts in honor of a woman whose fluency in 2 tongues had prevented what might otherwise have become another season of bloodshed along the river. Amos used the last of his 11 years' savings, in the end, not to buy the 80 acres he had once dreamed of alone, but to add a fine new barn and a second story to the ranch house Virginia's father had built, so that the land which had nearly been stolen from her, and which had first brought them together on that bitter cold auction morning, became instead the shared foundation of a life neither of them had quite dared to imagine for themselves. Standing together on their own porch that winter, watching the first heavy snow settle soft and silent over the bridge they had built and the river it now safely spanned, Virginia leaned into the solid warmth of her husband's shoulder and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely safe. "No more crossings," she said. "Not for you. Not ever again, unless it's this one right here, coming home to me every evening." "This is the only crossing I ever needed," Amos said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Took me 11 hard years and 1,100 miles 11 times over to find it, but I found it, Virginia, right here with you." Below them, the frozen river caught the last light of the setting sun and turned it to silver, and somewhere across the water, in the settlement that had grown up strong and honest around their shared crossing, lamps were being lit one by one against the coming dark, each small flame a testament to 14 families who had kept their land, a clerk who had found his courage, a wagon master who had found his home, and a woman who had ridden through bitter cold to warn every last one of them, and in doing so, had found the truest crossing of her own life waiting for her at the other side.